I work at a country gas station on a busy highway. Our customers are the people who commute to and from the city for work. Every morning they come in wanting their coffee and biscuits before filling their tanks. And most of them stop for a snack and energy drink in the evening. We get truckers and the random passerbys throughout the day. But those morning and evening rushes are what keep the lights on. Most of the time, it's about the most routine, boring job you can have, unless there's a tornado. I'm in Louisiana. It rains a lot here, and we're known to throw epic hurricane parties. But tornadoes are a pretty rare occurrence for us. During my 35-year lifetime, there's only been 3 in my area. And the first 2 were so far on the other side of town, I didn't even know it was happening until I saw the pictures later. But the third one, that sucker came straight for me. It was a Friday, and I was working with my boss, Ted, and 2 others, Linda and Robbie. We knew the weather was supposed to get rough after lunch, but it was nothing we were concerned about. It was gloomy out, and the rain started just after lunch. The wind was blowing, and the occasional bolt of lightning flashed through the sky. But then it got dark. It looked like the sun was setting, yet it was barely 1 p.m. Then the temperature dropped. It was probably only a few degrees, but you could instantly feel the difference. That was about the time our phones started getting tornado warning alerts. Though actual twisters are rare for us, the warnings are just as uncommon. Every so often, one will be attached to a severe thunderstorm notification. But we're so used to them being false alarms that we don't take them very seriously. But when we looked outside, we all knew this was different. The sky turned downright sinister. I don't think I've ever seen the clouds so close to truly being black. The rain turned to hail. The wind was blowing so hard, it ripped the door from Ted's hand. Robbie stepped outside and lost his hat, as in literally lost it. It blew off of his head and kept on going. When he started to chase after it, Ted grabbed his arm and pulled him back inside. We could actually see the tornado forming in the distance. It dropped down before our very eyes, and it was coming straight for us. Because it was so far down the highway, Linda wanted to jump in her car and try to outrun it, but Ted knew there wasn't enough time to outrun this thing. Ted hollers for all of us to file inside, into the walk-in cooler. At first, Robbie, Linda, and I tried to reason that leaving was the best way. But before we could finish our argument, the tornado was even closer. We definitely didn't have time. As we barricaded ourselves within the cold walk-in, we braced ourselves as a loud rumble got closer and closer to where we were. The rumble was soon accompanied by sounds of thrashing metal, the crashing and cracking of wood, and all of the goods from the store being thrown around, and who knows what else. I've never been in an earthquake, but the way we shook inside that walk-in, it felt like the earth was moving beneath us. Only it wasn't the earth that was moving. It was us. The walk-in was practically being lifted and dropped back down. Small movements, not enough to move us physically up and down, just enough to knock things off the shelves. I could hear Linda whimpering each time it happened. For all of 5 minutes, it just sounded like total destruction was taking place, and in that time, the power completely went out. I think that was the scariest part. I wasn't even paying attention to the racket outside anymore. There was enough going on inside to keep me distracted. With the power out, we could no longer see each other or the items falling off the shelves and onto us. I know at one point I stood up and I cradled my head with my arms, trying to block anything from hitting my head or face. But I could feel coagulated gravy under my feet. It must have been one of the various things to fly off the shelves, and it now covered the ground, making it slippery and impossible to keep balanced. At one point, a heavy plastic container of what I can only assume held potatoes came tumbling down, the corner of the bin smashing one of my fingers, but luckily, not my head. I heard Robbie shriek in pain, but I couldn't see a damn thing. I called out asking if everyone was all right. Ted, Linda, they each gave me a response to indicate that they were conscious. So I told them to cover their heads, hoping they already were but couldn't be sure. My eyes were tightly shut for what felt like forever, but soon, and I mean, it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes after it all started, everything was scary quiet. There was no wind, no rain, no sound of flying debris. There was only the sound of our own breathing, which by this time was pretty heavy. We stayed in that walk-in until it got too hot to handle. Ted was the first one out. It took all of us to get the door opened, but eventually we broke through the debris on the other side, and as soon as he walked through to the other side, he gasped. The rest of us shuffled out quickly behind him, and involuntarily did just the same. Truly, we couldn't believe what we saw. Nothing. The entire store, which housed the walk-in cooler, was gone. Not just the roof, not just the walls, but everything had been completely gutted. The goods on the shelves, the register, the coolers, all of it was thrown into various piles of unrecognizable junk. Our cars had been completely flipped around, no longer in their designated spots behind the building that no longer stood. We aren't even sure to this day where the little motorbike ended up. The only thing still standing, practically untouched, was the walk-in. By God's good graces, and probably Ted's good thinking, we survived against all odds. Eventually, Linda remembered she'd taken a bag into the cooler, filled with our cell phones. I grabbed my cell phone from the bag and called emergency services, while she poured over the damage with Ted and Robbie. As I waited to get through, I remember thinking it was odd we hadn't heard a single siren throughout the ordeal or since it ended. When someone answered and I explained our location, the woman on the line was shocked. It was clear that they had assumed there were no survivors in the area, especially no one from the store, which was no longer standing. It wasn't immediate, but soon enough we heard the sound of something that's usually not so sweet. The sound of sirens. The store was a total loss, and there'd be a lot of rebuilding to do, but at least we were alive. Every year at the end of May, the family decides on a vacation destination. A few years ago, we planned our trip to the Grand Canyon. It was going to be 3 days of camping, hiking, and outdoor adventures with my daughter, Peyton, who was 6. She's a girly girl, and most of what she packed in her suitcase were princess dresses and Barbies. She was horrified when I showed her the big, cumbersome hiking boots that she'd be wearing most likely the whole trip, as opposed to her plastic Beauty and the Beast slippers that she'd wear religiously around the house. We also couldn't leave without her packing her pink Barbie Jeep. Thankfully, we've got a big enough SUV, but loading and unloading was a nightmare in itself, but I won't bother you with the details of that. Let's just say by the time we got to our campground, the 6-hour trip had worn on all of our patience. As me and Casey set up the tents, Peyton was exploring off the beaten path in her Jeep. Our campground was mostly flat and rocky, with trees scattered about every couple of feet. The terrain felt like a desert, and the few trees scattered about didn't bring any needed shade. Later in the afternoon, we're getting the fire started, and Peyton runs up to us with a huge smile on her face. In a burst of giddy excitement, she tells us that she's seen a beautiful blue fairy dancing by the trees. Her nose scrunches up, and she says she's going to try to catch it. Casey and I share a laugh at our dusty princess and her fun imagination. Peyton's grown up in the city. Our confined location means that we have to get creative with our resources to have a good time. Out camping, she was free to run wild. I got out her butterfly net from our gear bag, and I told her not to go too far. With determination in her heart, she grabs the net, hops back into her Jeep, and speeds off, kicking up rocks and dirt with her plastic tires. Honestly, it was a real cinematic moment. With the terrain being so level, she could get a couple 100 yards away with her still being within eyesight. Around that range, she stops her Jeep and begins searching for the elusive fairy she'd just seen. Net in hand, we watch her begin to stalk around the trees. We think she's going to be occupied with that hunt for a while. So Casey and I throw a few more logs on the fire and prepare some dinner. We bought a little grated cooking top that we could put directly over the fire and started cooking up some burger patties. We're sitting in our lawn chairs. I'm having a beer and the food is about to be done on the fire. And Casey's keeping us cool by spritzing the air with an iced water spray bottle. In the distance, she sees the Barbie Jeep making its way towards us. She tells me Peyton's coming back. Then Casey says, it looks like she caught something too. I look and I see Peyton. She has the pedal to the metal with the butterfly net held above her head in a victorious pose. I'm running the grill, so Casey's the one who meets Peyton first when she arrives. I listen in on her story. She says, I saved the fairy from a giant spider. The fairy was flying away from me and tried hiding in a hole, but the big spider was in there. They both popped out of the hole. It looked like the spider was winning, so I kicked it to save the fairy. Then I got her with the net. Oh, my fearless little girl. The story is enough to make me leave the burgers and walk over to her and Casey and see the fairy that she saved. Even before digging into the net, I could see something hopping around. The sound of its fluttering wings reminded me of a moth, but louder. Peyton says, Look, Daddy, and opens the white mesh netting. It was unwise of me to then enthusiastically lean my head over the open net, because in retrospect, I knew a fairy wasn't going to be in that net. I don't know why I did it. As my grinning face eclipsed the hole of the butterfly net, it blocked the escape of the flying creature. Like seeing a rock hit your windshield, it moved too fast for my eyes to process, and it hit me in the face before I could move out of its way. When I throw my head back, my hands instinctively swipe at what's on my face, but before I can make contact with it, Peyton's fairy stings me on the left side of the cheek, with a stinger large enough for me to feel its penetration. Then, within a blink, the worst searing pain I've ever felt in my entire life filled my face. It's to this day the most excruciating pain I've ever felt on any part of my body. I've been hit in the face with fists, baseballs, and even a bowling ball growing up. None of these, not even the bowling ball that literally caved my nasal cavity, nothing compared to the pain I felt that day. It was mind-numbing. All I could do was fall backwards and scream. It felt like someone heated a railroad spike until it was red hot, then started hammering it into my cheek. I can feel the venom working its way through my bloodstream. It radiates down my spine, and I can feel each of my muscles begin to constrict. My ears were ringing. I'd screamed the air out of my lungs, and in between me taking another breath, I could hear Peyton and Casey also screaming their lungs out and running around me. I can't move my neck. It's as if I'm paralyzed down to my shoulders. All I can do is kick my legs. It swells the whole left side of my face, and the stabbing pain continues to hit me full force. Minutes feel like hours, but as the torment slowly begins to recede, the ringing in my ears subsides, and I can hear Casey on the phone with emergency services. They're getting ready to send a helicopter out to airlift me to the hospital. But I waved at her not to do that. My left eye was swollen shut, and the pain was still throbbing, but I knew I wasn't dying. Casey would have to drive us all the way out of the canyon, but we didn't need an airlift. For a moment, though, I sure thought that I was dying. The sting area was red and left an ache for the remainder of the day. After this thing dropped me, Casey said that she soaked it with a spray bottle and wet its wings, then stomped it. When I got to see what actually got me, I was astonished. I'd never seen an insect this big in real life. I mean, I could understand how a 6-year-old could mistake this for a fairy. I know Peyton hadn't seen anything like this either. To give an idea of its size, do this. Open your hand and spread all 5 fingers as wide as possible. From the gap between your pointer and thumb to your pinky is how large it was. The curve of your hand is also how it was shaped. The blue fairy Peyton introduced us to was actually an insect, specifically a type of wasp called the tarantula hawk. I don't know who's more traumatized by this, honestly. Peyton hadn't really stopped talking about the time Daddy almost died at the Grand Canyon. But I'm still plagued with nightmares that I find their nest. They chase me until I wake up. I can still hear their heavy wings after I'm awake. My left cheek still has a red small dot that resembles a freckle where the venom destroyed cell tissue, scarring me. I thought I was gonna die that day. I accidentally terrified Peyton away from her fantasy interest. I think a little bit of her still thinks that a fairy tried to murder me.